Welcome to the BreakPoint podcast and our Q&A segment, Ask the Colson Center. I'm Shane Morris. I'm here with John Stonestreet to answer your questions. These questions are based on BreakPoint commentaries and podcasts that we've aired, short courses that we've held, and articles and columns we've posted. If you want to submit a question of your own, you can do that by emailing us at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. And John, we're really packed with questions this week, and not just not just surface level questions. These are deep questions, really tough moral quandaries, like kind of the trolley problem genre. I gotta say, my least favorite type
What
of
did you just
questions,
call it? The what?
the trolley problem genre. You know the trolley problem memes where you have the two tracks and you're at the switch and you have to decide whether the trolley is
Oh,
going to hit
got
like
it.
three people on the track or yeah, right. That's
Got it. All right.
it clarifies moral principles, and these are the sorts of questions that we're getting, but they're anything but hypotheticals. And there's nothing cartoonish about them. They're
Now,
very
these are
real.
these are incredible questions, and I'm looking at our list, and as always, we're not going to get to all of them. They're just amazing, and all of them. I hope people, I spend so much time on during the week on BreakPoint, on the point, even in BreakPoint this week. We just got to keep moving, and so the opportunity that we have to slow down and walk through these questions is I know kind of a stylistic difference from, some of our other daily commentaries in particular, but I hope it's a good lesson. Like, we live in such a kind of a meme and slogan sort of culture, as if, the phrase "love is love" answers all of our questions about marriage and
Right.
public policy or something like
Argument
that.
over at that point.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And it's just not good. And so, especially with these questions, I just want to say thanks to our audience. I mean, we get so many of these, and they're
Mm.
so good, and we are trying to get to as many of them as possible, but to also handle them well. But we're really honored to have this conversation. We just started this last year,
Yeah.
and it's really been it's a highlight for me of the week. I just enjoy it, and it's just and I hope it's really helpful.
Well, it's a genre difference for us. It's a pace change for us because, and it was inspired, if I remember correctly, by conversations we were having behind the scenes where we would get questions and then we would go at the end of it, hey, that was pretty cool. Let's maybe let's open the curtains a little bit and let people see what's going on behind the scenes. And this is very spontaneous when we talk about this stuff. It's not like we've sat down beforehand and sort of hashed out our answers. We're just tackling the questions as they come. So let me start off with this first one, and this is one where I've had to paraphrase because it was like 800 words long when we got it, but it was very thorough, well written, and I just want to thank this listener for taking the time to explore all the different dimensions of this. And it's a question we're going to have to be dealing with a lot more because of the configuration in Washington right now. It looks very likely that the Equality Act or something very like it is going to be passed in the near future. So this person asks, in light of the Equality Act, thinking that its passage is inevitable, wants to know if it forces us to stop speaking the truth in love to LGBT individuals, how it will translate to the workplace, what Christian employees should do when forced to sign, for instance, or demanded that they sign a non-discrimination policy. What about artistic expression? This listener works for an independently owned franchise of a large beverage company that builds grocery store displays that are sometimes LGBT themed. And this person wants to know what happens when it's time for me to set up one of those displays. Should I refuse? Where does it end? Is it crazy to refuse to even hang a pro-LGBT sign, for instance? What about, say, accountants who manage donations a company makes to pro-LGBT charities? Is that person violating their conscience by writing the checks? And then they finish with, of course, everyone should have basic human rights, the ability to find employment, food, housing, medical care, the ability to buy a hammer at the hardware store. I love that. But where does that line start and stop for followers of Christ? It seems obvious in many situations, but it isn't always crystal clear.
It isn't always crystal clear. That's the first answer, and we should be expecting that it's not going to be crystal clear. There was one of the most moving letters that I have read from Dietrich Bonhoeffer to his former seminary students. That was written near the end of his life, around Christmas time, And he talks to, of course, these were seminary students. They ran an underground seminary, got shut down by the Gestapo. And these guys went on, and many of them became pastors. Some of them, though, actually were, forced or, all but forced to join military service. And so they were wrestling with all of this. And he said something along the lines like, has there ever been a group of people where every way forward seems equally intolerable, where there's no clear answer? And he said, the thing is that Christians don't live in a world of just moral debate. And it's this wonderful phrase, which is the only phrase I think that could actually sum up all of Bonhoeffer's theology, because he really kind of went all over the place in many ways. But he believed that because of the incarnation, faith was incarnational. There wasn't a way to get around it. You only had to go through it. And so he had this wonderful phrase, come out into the tempest of the living. And we're going to be hitting that in a new way. Every cultural moment is the real world for ourselves. This is the place where God's called us. And so we have to walk through it. But when it gets unclear like this, it does get difficult. Let me just say a couple things. First of all, we need to know what the Equality Act is. We've done a ton of stuff on this in the past, and we will be doing some updates in the next in the next few days, in the next few weeks, because of how essential it is. If you come to breakpoint.org, we'll link to the commentaries that we've already put out on the Equality Act and the various descriptions of it. The Equality Act was off the table. I know President Biden, during his campaign, said that he was going to have the Equality Act signed within the first 100 days. That was a completely unrealistic promise. It would have gone into the category of, what you campaign on versus what you govern on, and those things aren't the same thing. It would have gone down like that had it not been for the change in the Georgia Senate seats and the outcome of that runoff race. That has put the Equality Act front and center. It's a live option. I don't know that he'll get it signed in the first 100 days, but I do think it'll be up on the table in the first 100 days. What it fully brings out will be decided by what it takes to get that passed. So there's going to be nuances here and nuances there. But essentially what's going to happen is that categories of sexual orientation and gender identity are going to be retroactively equated with race in all of the federal legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, an act that was designed to overcome systemic culture-wide injustice in which African Americans couldn't fully participate in life. That's the fundamental reason many of us are opposed to it. Well, two reasons is that it treats sexual orientation and gender identity as an immutable category like race. Secondly, it offers the same access as if the same lack of access to society has been experienced by members of the so-called LGBTQ community, which just isn't true. There's just no way to say that. So that's what the Equality Act does. And this will go out in employment. It will go out in, in education. It will affect so many different segments of society. I'll give you an example of not only how it goes out in society, but then it becomes kind of the new beachhead for it to go out even further. So in last year's Supreme Court decision in Bostock versus, was it Hodges, I think, which had to do with employment for a transgender employee, the Supreme Court ruled that you couldn't fire someone on the basis of gender. It was Neil Gorsuch's extremely strange interpretation, which was weird. And
Bostock versus Clayton County is the name of the
Clayton County. Obergefell versus
Hodges is Obergefell. Yeah, right.
Yeah, see, it all runs together. It's a big mishmash of bad decisions. Bostock versus Clayton County. Thanks. So what happened in the first week of office is that President Biden said extended LGBTQ, an executive order having to do with LGBTQ protections, but justified it based on what Bostock versus Clayton County had ruled, which was very narrowly decided only in a particular realm of employment. The executive order was applied beyond employment, and they cited we're just applying Bostock, which there's nothing in that decision that forced that executive order at any level.
Mhm.
But that's how this stuff works. Once these decisions, I know it's going to, oh, it's a slippery slope fallacy, and we go back to it. Yeah, but the slope is, but the ground is sloped and it's slippery, and we keep sliding.
Yeah, maybe
But
the Overton window is the better
yeah, in
way
this
of
case,
speaking
it
of
is.
this. Yeah, right. Because what used to be unthinkable is now becoming unquestionable, and when you do that, the stuff that's unthinkable from that perspective then begins to become much more thinkable. So it just keeps on moving and moving until somebody, stops it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's here. I mean, look, I wish it were different. A year ago, if you would have asked, is the Equality Act an
Hmm.
imminent possibility? I would have said no.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, there's a remade judiciary. That's clear. So it's not clear what the Supreme Court will do with this. The Supreme Court doesn't like to do broad sweeping Roe v. Wade sorts of decisions anymore. So
Hmm.
that's why you saw in Masterpiece Cake Shop and in Bostock versus Clayton County, um, other than a Obergefell versus Hodges, we haven't had that kind of a sweeping kind of redefining thing. Either the decisions are limited to a particular case or a particular area of culture, or something like that. Now, the question though is, what should I do? How do I respond to this? What is my conscience rights? What does it look like to do the right thing? And this is where it isn't always crystal clear. I will say that the best advice I know of, is this: don't do something that makes you say something that's not true. I think if that's the rule of thumb, and again, people who've been listening the last couple of weeks know where this is coming from. It's coming from a title of a book by Rod Dreher, but more specifically to a speech that book is named after by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And we'll link to that whole speech if you come to breakpoint.org. And please, please, please read it. We'll link to a Breakpoint commentary I did on it, and we read most of it. Because he just kind of goes down the line in that cultural situation and says, speak not by lies. I'm not saying go protest everything. I'm not saying go fight for every cause. I'm just saying don't be forced to say something that's not true. So here's what that looks like. And he lists 7 or 8 or 9 different scenarios that needs to be that line. And I think it's really good advice. I think it's something probably that families need to talk over. I think it's something that parents need to talk with their kids. It's like, you may very well find yourself in a situation where you're being forced to say something that's not true. What should you do, kids? If your grade is on the line, or your degree, or your scholarship. And yeah, all of this, I think, eventually is going to get into what I've called in the past the theology of being fired. Um, when does my loyalty to my Lord supersede, everything else? I mean, obviously it should. What does that look like as it plays out? But I think that commitment, let's just not say what's not true, is a great place to start. It's not going to be it, but it's going to be a good place to start.
Yeah, and the context here of the one particular application in the question of, grocery store displays is actually eerily reminiscent of Václav Havel's Power of the Powerless,
Oh, right. Yeah.
where he talks about the greengrocer, and that's his example. Is that, we've mentioned this before, and I think Rod Dreher is the one who's popularized this more recently, where you have this greengrocer in the Soviet Union or one of the Soviet bloc states, and he's saying, he has this sign that says "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't really believe in the Marxist agenda, but he puts it out front anyway or he faces a choice of whether to put it out front in order to satisfy the party. Because if you don't do that, if you don't have the "Workers of the world unite" sign out front, then is anyone going to buy from you? And are the officials going to tolerate you? Are they going to suspect you of being insufficiently enthusiastic about the party? And that is very much similar, in a sort of principled way. Not necessarily. I'm not saying that the KGB is going to come down on you. The LGBT KGB, is going to come down on you for failing to show sufficient allegiance. But you will face consequences. Most likely, there will be circumstances inevitably in the next few years where, not even from just the Equality Act, but from corporate pressure, where if you refuse to, say, put up a big display with rainbow flags, trying to sell chips or Pepsi or something, that you could face termination, and that's a real financial hardship and a real blow to your life. So we're going to have to ask these questions. You have to give some room, I think, at the front end of the thing for casually participating and living in a society. So, like, when I go to the grocery store, and we keep coming back to grocery stores here. When I stock up on products that I need, like toothpaste or juice for my kids, or toilet paper or whatever. If I go buy gas at 7-Eleven, inevitably I can tell you that probably like half to two-thirds of the companies that I'm buying from at that point will have donated to causes that I consider morally objectionable. And the the difficulty you face when you actually break it down and figure out who's donating to these causes, who's not, is interminable. I mean, you can't live in the world, like St. Paul said. I'm not telling you to disassociate from unbelievers, otherwise you'd have to leave the world. And the same thing is kind of true here. There is a place where you just can't help it on some level, participating or supporting financially. However, there is a clear line I think you can begin to draw. And the analogy I like is actually just war, where you have this modern philosophy of total war versus Christian just war theory, where in just war, you're not allowed to attack non-combatants, right? You have to stick with combatants, and you're allowed collateral damage and things like that. But you have to target the people who are targeting you, who are a threat to your life, to your side's lines, and so forth. You can't just say, well, if I go kill a bunch of civilians, then I've dealt a blow to the other side, and the civilians are participating in some material way in the general war effort of the enemy. True as that may be, they're not enemy combatants. They're not. That's not the direct intent or the direct thrust of what's going on. I think something a little bit similar applies here, where if what you're doing is incidentally or non-necessarily supporting a cause you don't believe in, that's more of a gray area. That's something where individual conscience is going to have to work it out. Like, if I buy Crest toothpaste, am I betraying my principles because I've given a few cents to some LGBT charity? That's something you have to figure out for yourself. I'm not telling you can't make those kinds of distinctions. Where it becomes much clearer in my mind is the kind of combatant non-combatant distinction, where the message is unmistakably coming with your endorsement or your artistic effort or your voice. Like, if I was, let's give an example here, since we're in a podcast. If I was in some sort of secular voiceover company and they asked me to do a commercial for like a pride march or something, I would have to say, no, I can't do that. I cannot lend my voice, literally, and my artistic ability to promoting this cause. And if you apply it to any other circumstances, it becomes pretty pretty easy to make this call, not to get to not to invoke Godwin's law here. But if I was in Nazi Germany and there was a cause that that I considered morally objectionable, that was part of their agenda of exterminating people or ruining people's lives, taking their businesses and homes and so forth, and I was asked to participate in some material fashion with that, I would take it very seriously. I would have to question,
Yeah.
very seriously what I was dealing with. And now that's all in the corporate sphere, because that was part of the question here.
Yeah. But hold on real quick, because I think a point of clarity here would also be to compare that with what wouldn't be legitimate.
Right.
For example, we live in a time of cancel culture where you don't get served. It's okay to not serve someone, whether or not it has to do with, quote unquote, as you say, being an enemy combatant, but
Yeah.
just by being on the wrong side. So let's say that somebody asks you to do a voiceover for a gay pride march, and
Mhm.
that would be communicating a message. That's a different thing than somebody who you look at and you think, I wonder what their sexual orientation is. I bet they are a member of the community, or
Right.
maybe even they have a glad pin or a rainbow flag, and they ask you to do a voiceover for something completely unrelated, and then you refuse service.
Mhm.
That's a different thing.
Yeah.
And that's why I think all the high profile cases that we've seen with Jack Phillips and Barronelle Stutzman in particular, but also the Larsons in Minneapolis, the what's the name of the creative company in Phoenix,
Mhm.
the calligraphy company.
Yeah.
Uh, every single one of these individuals, and I think this is an answer to this person's question, is that we have to make that distinction. Anytime we say no to someone because of who they are, that's discrimination that is not legitimate. But
Sure.
saying no to a request to support something that's not true, that's a different thing. So
Yeah.
right now, for
Which is, you
example,
see that in the Jack Phillips case. That's a really good
still,
test
I
case
don't, I don't know if
because
people know this. I literally just learned again, Shane, that there is a private lawyer in Denver that continues to
still going
just
after him.
right, and he will not stop. They have worked on all kinds of ways to try to get this thing over. I mean, this has been how many years of Jack's life now? 9.
Yeah.
And Shane, it's a lawyer who identifies as transgender, a man who identifies as a woman, who has just said, I will not leave you alone unless you bake this cake for me. And the cake is a gender transition cake,
Hmm.
and publicly apologize. So the idea that you won't serve me isn't true. He has served him.
Right.
And the original case, same thing with with good heavens, Baroness Stutzman.
Baroness Sussman, the florist.
He was a client of hers for a decade. They were friends.
Hmm.
And it was one project that she said that I can't do. Now, the other thing to bring up too, and we've said this before, is that the Equality Act was designed to deal with public accommodation issues.
Hmm.
So if you're African American in the 50s trying to drive across America, you actually couldn't do it. You couldn't participate because you couldn't find gas stations, hotel rooms, and things like that. And in the case of Jack Phillips, the couple that said, bake me a same-sex wedding cake could have literally walked could have walked to half a dozen other bakeries that would have fulfilled that request. In other words,
Right.
there's nothing in this that limits participation in society. And that helps draw a line as well. So if you say, refusal to let somebody have a place to live, refusal to let somebody, come into your store,
Hmm.
that's a different question than being forced to being co-opted into a message.
Yeah, you could ask, what is the point? What am I being asked to do? Am I being asked to deliver a product or service? Or am I buying a product or service where the point is, the toothpaste? Is the point the cake? Is the point the public accommodation, the lunch counter kind of thing? Or is the point the message I'm supposed to send that endorses this lifestyle, moral choice, sexual orientation, whatever? That's where you got to really draw the line, and that's where it begins to become unconscionable. It goes from ambiguous to unconscionable. Yeah, I'm just not, for the sake of my own sanity, I have avoided questions of where my money is going to support who or what, unless it becomes like a super overt thing where this company declares that the whole purpose of their existence is to promote this thing.
But
Like,
those decisions are going to get harder. And I think
right.
that's the spirit of this question, is that, because now at times giving to these companies or giving to these causes is a badge of honor.
Mhm.
It's one thing to not know. I mean, I remember conversations about P&G, and I'm like, good heavens, P&G has, first of all, a billion products and
Yeah.
going a billion different
And who
directions.
owns these guys? You're like, who are they a subsidiary of? You can't go down that road. You can't go too
Publicly
far down
traded,
that
privately
rabbit hole.
traded subsidiary. Yeah. And
Right.
but it is going to be harder. And I think that's the spirit of the question. And I hope this is at least a little bit of a framework to move ahead. But everyone pay attention to the Equality Act. Come to breakpoint.org. We'll
Yeah.
give an up to date, as much as we can,
Yeah.
and keep you up to date on where that's headed.
Okay, so let's move on to a question here that I found really interesting. It's based on, as best I can tell, our conversation recently on BreakPoint this week, and then we mentioned it as well in the last Q&A session. And it's about President Biden and the acknowledgement that I kind of opened up with on the program of the fact that he had, invoked God. He quoted St. Augustine, he quoted scripture, and he's kind of been wearing his Catholicism on his sleeve. This is a skeptical or self-identified humanist who writes in, and this person says, why isn't it enough for you to have the president acknowledge a God, a thoroughly devout Catholic, in his speeches? We're bound to have disagreements between Christians, Unity followers, Episcopalians, Seventh-day Adventist, Mormons, and so on. I can say as a humanist that I'm pleased to have theological references in the invocations and benedictions for people who want them. Why is it so necessary to continually discredit references to your religion by others because they don't buy the whole enchilada? And of course, that's a reference to the fact that, man, I'm kind of hungry now. It's a reference to the fact that we follow that acknowledgement of the speech and the religious references up with pointing out the inconsistencies in the stated and intended policies that President Biden is pushing. And so let's talk about that. Why isn't it enough for a candidate to just come out and wear his Christianity on his sleeve, and for us to acknowledge that, look, Christians disagree. This is something we can just still be friends over.
Yeah, I love the question, and I love the interaction.
Yeah.
I'll just say a couple things. First of all, understanding this has to do with what you think is true about God. Secularism, which really shapes, for example, the worldview that most humanists hold, doesn't necessarily mean that someone denies religion or religious belief or a belief in God. What it means is that they think that that should be kept personal and private, or that the substance of who God is isn't really a reflection of what is actually true about that God, but what one actually senses or feels. It doesn't disprove religious faith or belief in God. It just privatizes it and personalizes it. And but that's really the point of contention here, is that when we're talking about God, are we talking about a personal private belief, or are we talking about something that is either true or false? Now, I do respect the fact, and this is true, we've heard this from a number of humanists or agnostics, that belief in God has brought good things to the world. And that seems to be an undertone of this question, which I really believe. He said, I'm grateful when we hear a reference to religion or theological references and so on, which is a way, I think, a way more historically consistent position than like Dan Barker or Mikey Weinstein. And Dan Barker, for example, from the Freedom from Religion Foundation, that religion actually harms people instead of helps people, despite many, many data points that say otherwise. And Mikey Weinstein that says any reference to God is kind of a theological imposition. So I do appreciate the
This
tone.
isn't someone who has a Christopher Hitchens bobblehead on their desk.
Maybe not. Yeah, that's a good point. But let me get to the heart of the question, which is, why does it matter what one believes about God, as long as they reference something about God? And I'll just say this. Let's say that you find yourself walking down the street in the Middle East, let's say Syria, or maybe even right now in Ethiopia, where there's a great deal of conflict, and you hear footsteps around the corner, or you hear footsteps behind you, and you turn around. Would it make a difference to know whether the person you're looking at is coming from a private church service that's Christian, or the local mosque? There's a dramatic difference between those who are, quote unquote, following the way of Mother Teresa and following the way of Muhammad, or following the way of, Al Qaeda, or, if you're in Nigeria, for example, and someone knocks at your door in northern Nigeria, would it make a difference to know whether that person is a member of your church or a Fulani herdsman? In other words, it's not enough to just believe in God. It matters what you believe about God. Now, I know the response might be, well, wait a minute, with President Biden, we're talking about all Christian. Well, yeah, but then there's two questions. The substance of Christianity is not what a Christian says. The substance of Christianity is what the religion itself has been revealed to be. And so first question, when someone acknowledges belief in God, is, does that belief actually align with the teaching of the religion itself? Otherwise, we have every member of the religion as an authority unto themselves, and it ceases to be one religion, it becomes many. Second, there's not just kind of wrapping paper difference between progressive Christianity and conservative Christianity, whether we're talking about within Protestantism, Catholicism, or anywhere else. There's a difference between those who believe that God is a person sovereignly over the affairs of the universe with holiness and righteousness, and those who believe that God is kind of a benevolent force that brings meaning and purpose to our lives. There's a difference between religions, even if they both have Christianity on the wrapping paper, who believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, incarnate in the flesh, who died for the sins of the world, and through that death actually paid the price and appeased the wrath of God, and then rose from the dead to secure his throne forever and
You just
ever.
excluded one of the groups on the list there that we got in the question, which is Mormons.
But Mormons, that's right. That's
From
right. Yeah.
Christology, right?
And if you believe, and I'm just using, kind of a more progressive Christianity, that um, uh, that Jesus was kind of a good guy like you and me. There is there's a line from Reinhold Niebuhr, who was critiquing, liberal Christianity in his day, and he talks about, a God without wrath, and a Christ without a cross, and
Men
so on.
without sin through the
Men without
ministrations of a
sin.
Christ without a cross. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I should have written it down because it's like one of the great quotes of all time.
Yeah.
And we talked about this recently with Elisa Childers, who has written a tremendous book on progressive Christianity. Now, President Biden acknowledges a Catholic faith. So far, he's done it to express kind of what kind of gives him personal meaning and motivation, which is great. And his press secretary a couple of days ago used it as a way to deflect a question about abortion. But there's a difference between a Catholic who believes that whether I agree with it or not, I'm under the authority of the teaching of my church, and a Catholic that believes that the teaching of the church is good suggestions, but I'm under a different authority. Yeah. And so we're just talking about different things, even if they have the same.
We call those paper. Protestants, in this case, liberal Protestants. Yeah, as I pointed out to someone on Twitter this week who tried to make that exact point. They were like, "Look at all the proportion of Catholics in the U.S. who believe that abortion is okay in all these circumstances, and who are okay with contraception and stuff." And I said, "You are aware that the Roman Catholic Church is not a democracy, right? I mean, I'm a Protestant, but even I know that you don't get to define the doctrine by a head count."
All of this reflects a belief about religion. And Steve Turner he was kind of a satirical kind of writer. He wrote a poem called Creed, and it was kind of like the Apostles' Creed for today in a satirical form. And in the middle of it, he goes, "We believe that all religions are the same. At least the one that we read is." And he goes, "They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of God, man, heaven, hell, sin, and salvation."
Yeah, right.
And it's this wonderful line, and we'll link to it, by the way, because everyone should read the whole thing. It's from like the early 80s or something like that. But it's just a wonderful, quick, satirical, funny, snarky way to say you're just misunderstanding the nature of religion. And I think that's at the heart. Now, all that to say, as we said on Monday when we were talking about Christian nationalism, right, which is also a religion. As we said, not everything that gets called Christian nationalism deserves that title, but and not all things that get called liberal Christianity deserve that title these days, for the record. But Christian nationalism, in its pure form, in which for example, turn belief in God into a means, and the salvation of a nation into the ends, or the advance of a nation in the ends, or things like that. That's not Christianity either, right. Even though it might have, again, the same name on the wrapping paper. You kind of think like the label that, the little label, that gets put on wrapping paper. It's just not the same, because it's not just that you believe in God, it's what you believe about God. And whether that belief comes from what you think, from some religious system, or from the revelation of God in Scripture.
And the point, I want to be really clear here, John, the point that we were making during our discussion about the inaugural address was not to question Joe Biden's personal faith. I'm not interested in trying to peer into Joe Biden's heart and figure out what's going on there. I'm interested in the inconsistency between his professed faith, which is not just Christianity, but Catholic Christianity, which has very strict rules on what exactly is doctrine, and how the laity should deal with those things. And he's very inconsistent. That's just a fact with the established positions, not just of creedal Christianity historically, but of Catholicism, which has a very well established teaching on these issues of sexuality and abortion and so forth. So he issues this proclamation and celebration of Roe v. Wade just a few days after being inaugurated. Well, the Catholic Church is not ambiguous about Roe v. Wade, about abortion, and it never has been. And so it's very reasonable, I think, to point out those kinds of inconsistencies, not just on the level of his church, but on the level of Christianity as a whole. And I want to illustrate this by going back to Godwin for a second. Um, I think that if our listener, the person who wrote in this question, asks themselves this question in return, it'll reveal a lot. Would you say that mere profession of Christianity is enough if the person in question, the politician in question, was supporting the Nazi Party and what they and their agenda? Would you say it's enough for them to just profess Christianity, even if they don't have the whole enchilada, even if they don't agree with you on everything, Bonhoeffer, then they're still Christians. I mean, they're still your buddies, and you should really celebrate that. Well, no, that's not the case. And I say that not to compare Joe Biden to a Nazi, but to illustrate the fact that there really are limits and parameters of what a person can support while professing to be a Christian, and really claim any sort of meaningful relationship between their faith and their policy prescriptions. Fact is, Christianity has a doctrine of the dignity of all human beings. You can't be a Nazi and a Christian, not consistently. The same is true of abortion and of LGBT rights ideology. You can't be a Christian and support these things consistently because Christianity has an established teaching on this stuff. As informal as that may be among Protestants, and as confusing as it may be to see churches, as you go down the streets of any city with rainbow flags on them, the fact is that they're out of step with all Christians throughout history until about 6 minutes ago. And
And
we
it's
shouldn't
not
be
just that
afraid to
they're out of
point that
step with
out.
tradition. This is an important point. They're not just out of step with tradition, they're out of step with the authority source,
Yes, which
right?
is scripture for Protestants.
Right. But both, Protestant Christianity and Catholic Christianity, don't they reflect that that there's an authority higher than ourselves, right?
Yeah,
So kind of the more cynical version of this question is often, how can you say you can't be a Christian and a fill in the blank?
right.
But that reflects because Christianity is a revealed religion, not a manufactured one.
Yeah, you can't be a Christian in any historical sense and a Buddhist, because
Right.
Buddhism, just the fact is, Buddhism contradicts the core tenets of Christianity. The very most core tenets about, God isn't equal with creation, and good and evil are things that actually exist. They're not just illusions and stuff like that. The same can be true. Same can be said of the fact that Christianity is not modern progressivism. It's just not. You only get there through a radical revision of it, and that's okay. That's fair game to point that out. And I'm not in the midst of that. I'm not questioning or attacking Joe Biden's personal piety. I think it's conceivable. Am I affirming that he's a Christian, by the way. I think it's conceivable for a person to have a radical disconnect between their personal, piety and their belief and faith and what they support externally. I hope and believe that ultimately God brings those things the Holy Spirit brings those things into accord. But I'm not interested in going there. I'm just talking about the external policies. I think you're doing the same thing, John.
Yeah. And, you can't be a Christian Buddhist, but there will be people who try. I
Right.
mean, that's the other thing is, we always say, well, he's a Christian and you know, again, it's not determined by someone else's authority, but we do live in a culture where everyone will try to mix everything. It's called the buffet approach to religion, right?
Yep,
So
absolutely.
a little this, a little of that.
In miracles, which, fair warning, I'm going to be referring a bunch to miracles in the future because I'm going through that right now, and I mean, it's amazing.
Stunning.
But Lewis, talks about the basic inclination of humankind religiously, and he thinks it's pantheism. He thinks it's just sort of this dime store pantheism, and that our intuitions naturally drift in that direction. And but just like our intuitions about what matter is made up of how atoms behave and what the nature of them is, just like our intuitions are misleading on that front, according to science, our intuitions religiously are misleading too. And so, you got to question those things. Well, John, our last question is a really hard one here, and I'm just going to read it because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is the kind of moral reasoning with the that we were talking about at the beginning of the program. The hard questions that we have to bring our Christian convictions and our moral principles to bear on. This person says, my father died of Alzheimer's. For the last 18 days of his life, he was unable to eat or drink. He was given comfort care. We believed that measures such as a feeding tube would unnecessarily prolong his suffering. Were we wrong? I feel called to advocate for the elderly. I work in a nursing home, and as I hear about euthanasia gaining ground, I know I need to become involved, but I'm not sure how. I see a day coming when people with Alzheimer's will be expected to die because their lives will be viewed as not worthwhile. My dad may have forgotten who I was, but I still know who knew who he was, and that his life mattered until his last breath when God wrapped dad in his arms and took him home. Well, what a beautiful, heartfelt, and sincere question. Thank you for writing this in. Thank you for asking this. Not only is this applicable to so many people in so many instances where they're walking with someone through the end of life. But this allows us to access and really bring out our deepest principles as pro-lifers, figure out what it is that that we're required to do in one of this most crucial moments in life, which is death.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing this wonderful account. It's a hard and wonderful account. It's a beautiful, and it's also a reminder that death and and the fall steals so much from us. And yet, your last line, that God wrapped dad in his arms, tells you what the end of the story is. That death doesn't ultimately win. And I was just struck by the line here. My dad, may have forgotten who I was, but I still knew who he was. And even more than that, God still knew who your dad was.
Yeah.
And of course, the psalmist takes us there in so many different ways, doesn't he? It's not even so much that we know God; it's that He knows us. It's a beautiful, wonderful, scary, and frightening thing. Psalm 139. No matter where you go, you're known. No matter what you try to hide, God sees you. I remember I was teaching a kind of a senior, a kind of capstone course at a Christian college once, Shane, and I went through that with them. And about half of them froze. And I'm like, what's wrong? And they're like, that's scary. God knows me. He sees me. You're known. It's a truth in Psalms that it's one of those, pools that a child can wade in and get comfort out of, and a grown-up can swim in and never hit the bottom of what it means to be known. And it has to inform our view of death. Let me just say up front, I think that from everything I know, I don't know the ins and outs of this situation. The question, were we wrong? Absolutely not. You handled this well. To say that we ought not preemptively take the life of the suffering because their lives are no longer dignified if they're suffering is not the same as providing comfort care and letting death take place. I know these are really tough things, because we are so good at prolonging life, and we are so good at and I say so good in a tongue in cheek, we're actually so bad at turning human life into commodities that have financial values. Both of those things are true of our culture at the same time, Shane. That's what makes us so difficult, is that we can unnaturally prolong life artificially. And usually that's done out of a desire from those not suffering to not lose. A lot of times this has to do with, for example, a parent and a child or something like that, because it can go on forever. It really can. And on the flip side, we also have a culture in which people in nursing facilities, like, for example, during the time of COVID, have been largely isolated and abandoned. We have the rationing of care in other countries. And some people would say here, this is just kind of a confusing thing. Let me point this questioner first and foremost to I think someone who's written really well about this, and if this is your career, and God bless you, if this is your career, I feel called to advocate for the elderly. I guess career is the wrong word. If this is your calling to do that,
Mhm.
God bless you. Christians are at their best when they run into the problem, not away from it. And we have a culture that doesn't know how to die, doesn't know how to suffer, doesn't know how to go through those stages. And God bless you. You can be an amazing witness for Christ in those places and for the dignity of life. And Christians should be at the forefront of this. But let me point you to a book called Bioethics, a Primer for Christians. The author's name is Gilbert Meilander, Mileander, Meilander, Gilbert Meilander. He's a professor at Valparaiso. He's been writing for years on these really important things. And there's a couple parts of that book that I don't fully agree with, but his stuff on the end of life and end of life care and what counts as pulling the plug and what counts as um, what's called extraordinary care versus
Mhm.
comfort care. Um, these are really tough lines these days, but there is a way to think through them. It has to do with intent. It has to do with bringing communities into it. Like, for example, Shane, a lot of times we want to put all the weight on, I wrote this down. This is my end of life decision, and what do you call it? Kind of a end of life will, or that's not the word for it.
Yeah, it's
Advanced directive.
advanced
Advanced
directive,
directive.
right?
And I write that, let's say I write that now, right? And it goes into a file cabinet. And 20 years from now, something happens to me. I get hit, I have a stroke, something like that. My wife pulls that out. Now, 20 years have passed. I've made that decision when she was at a different place, I was at a different place, my kids were at a different place, and I'm going to impose that decision on her. And yet, when we stood up in front of the church, what did we do? We committed, saying, "Till death do we part. I belong to you. You belong to me." Right? So, in other words, my life is not my own. First of all, it belongs to God. Secondly, it's been given to my wife in marriage. And so, one of the things I really appreciate about Dr. Meilander's work there is he talks about this community involvement and walking someone through that. And as the sufferer, I shouldn't just impose my disconnected will on other people, but I should trust them to do the right thing.
Hmm.
Now, that's a really vulnerable place to be if you don't trust that person, right? And so, but all of these issues have to be dealt with. Uh, and I'll end with this. What a great question, man. I'm so touched by this question. Let me end with this. Ecclesiastes says there's a time to live, there's a time to die, time to be born, a time to die. There is a time to die. It really is.
Yeah.
And we're a world that at times wants to speed up death. We see death as an escape, or we see death as the enemy that the final enemy that we can't beat. Neither one of those things are true. Scripture says that death has no sting. It doesn't have the victory. And because there's life after death, and these decisions have to be made in view of who we belong to God, to others. They
Mhm.
have to be made in terms of that death isn't the unbeatable foe, that Christ has defeated this foe. These are where kind of these nebulous theological beliefs and categories have to move. Going back to our last question, from the kind of this realm of personal, private, this makes me feel better, and to like, is this true or not?
Yeah.
Is this real or not? So God bless you for this question. May God comfort you in the loss of your dad. Thanks for walking with him, not, and standing with him. Be confident. God knows your dad. God knows you. I just think all of us need to be having these questions. And Shane, your generation to my generation, this is going to be front and center on our, in our lives in the years to come, just because of the way the generation gap goes, or the generation differences go. I mean, we have an aging generation, and this is going to be a decision we're faced over and over and over. Not to mention, we're just headed into that stage of life of having to see that with our friends,
Yeah.
counsel our friends and neighbors through that, and deal with it ourselves.
Well, let me close with making a distinction here that I think is crucial to remember, and it's hinted at in the second half of the question. And that is about the pressure that people with terminal illnesses like Alzheimer's will be faced with in the future. And I think that instinct is right. I think that we should expect that pressure to really mount in the future for people with terminal illnesses to just, hurry up and die, to get out of the way. And that doesn't just apply to Alzheimer's. It applies to a whole panoply of different either terminal or chronic conditions. And the distinction I want to make there is that there's a huge difference, like you mentioned earlier, John, between hastening death and in accepting or embracing death. We as Christians believe, and this is one of our foundational worldview pillars that we don't often talk about, but that is going to become increasingly relevant in this high-tech, medically competent world. And that is that we believe God is sovereign over life and death. He is the one who gives life and who takes it ultimately, not us. We're never to be in the circumstance where we are making that kind of decision for someone against the ordination of God. And what that, we accommodate in that understanding that we heal, that we do our best to resolve health issues, to save life whenever we can, and then to restore. But it also doesn't mean on the other side that we have to indefinitely preserve life, that we have to fight death at all costs, and that we have to ultimately say no where God has said yes. It's time to go. And that is where this questioner begins. But the answer to that question has implications for the other half, which is the pressure that people are going to feel to engage in, assisted suicide, or to accept euthanasia for people whose lives we no longer consider worth living and whose deaths we would like to hasten. There is a huge difference, and we see it in end of life issues. We see it at beginning of life issues with things like ectopic pregnancies, between treating a condition and foreseeing that death is inevitable, and intending a death to happen. And the best way to test this is to just ask, what do you think, or what do you intend? Like, what would you be happy with if you're morally very concerned with this question? Say you're pulling a loved one off of a ventilator. If they began breathing again on their own and started to recover, would you be pleased with that outcome? If so, then you did not intend their death. You didn't intend to euthanize them. The same cannot be said for the person who deprives oxygen, or who injects them with something, or something along those lines, to intentionally induce death. And then there's one more category that I think the author you mentioned brings this up, but this is one of those key categories that we have to think through when we're dealing with end of life issues, and that is the introduction of extraordinary care versus its withdrawal. So there is a real momentous moral decision made when you decide to introduce extraordinary care. So a ventilator, or an alternative method of delivering food, or something like that. Those are medical interventions that preserve bodily life, and you have to make a very tough decision at that point as to whether that's something you should introduce, because as numerous pro-life authors have pointed out, that then creates a whole new set of difficult questions that you have to answer. So ultimately, John, I love your answer, coming back to Scripture and reminding us that death does not have the last word. And for Christians, death is no longer the ultimate enemy with its sting over us, with its power over us. It's lost that.
I need to make one clarification. I'm just kind of thinking back through what I said, and I don't want to alter anything, just kind of maybe edit my comments on advanced directives. I'm not saying advanced directives are immoral and unethical. Actually, they're great ideas.
Just maybe not the most effective way of dealing with
it. No, it's just that oftentimes it's kind of like we treat advanced directives like, our tombstone, like we buy it and then forget about it until we need it. Advanced directives have to be consistently revisited and updated in light of what we know, in light of technology, in light of medicine, in light of advice, in light of relational situations. In other words, it's not just a do it and forget it for 20 years. I mean, just for example, the definition of death has changed
Yeah.
About, I think, a dozen times just in the latter part of the
Yeah.
20th century. It
That's
just
something
kind
you
of
don't
goes
think
back and
about.
forth.
Is it brain function? Is it heartbeat? Is it, I mean, how do you define it exactly?
Yeah, and this affects all kinds of other things. I don't want to get into organ donation, but we've had critiques that about whether
Yeah.
there's a shortage, whether that now becomes a crisis, and now whether that has created some sort of rush to acquire organs and things like
Mm.
that. And there's a whole lot to be talked about here. I'm not making a definitive statement one way or another yet. Maybe that question will come up, but
Mm.
the advanced directive, it is. I mean, that is a great way to go about it, having medical power of attorney. But these are decisions that need to be, revisited and revisited.
Mhm.
Not because the truth of who you are changes, not because the theological ground changes, but because the cultural ground shifts so quickly in these
Yeah.
areas, and our relational grounds can shift. And so anyway, I just wanted to, I can just hear the folks in our group going, "What you said we shouldn't do an event?" No, I didn't. You should do an advanced directive. It just shouldn't be a one and done for 20 years.
Right. Absolutely. Well, folks, I want to thank you so much for these great questions. You guys have been the star of this program today. What a great set of questions, thought-provoking issues that we've wrestled through here, and I hope that our responses have been helpful. Thanks again as well for listening to the BreakPoint podcast. John and I will be back next week answering more of your worldview questions. If you want to ask one, again, you can drop us a message on social media or preferably email us at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. That's the easiest way for us all to get these questions and work through them. We'd love to engage with everyone. For John Stone Street and the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next week.